Something was off from the start. Not a dramatic failure, not an explosive mistake, just everything slightly wrong, a slow burn, a season that seemed cursed by delays, poor yields, and grinding frustration. Parker Schnabel didn't step into this season expecting a smooth ride. But even he didn't predict the perfect storm of problems that would follow. 4 months in, his team was already exhausted. The Dominion Creek claim, once hailed as a gold mine with massive potential, had become a logistical nightmare. Haul routes were long, equipment strained, and time was always the enemy. The worst part is the gold. It was there, but it was underperforming, dragging its feet as if mocking the crew's efforts. Consistent, yes, but consistently poor. And when your entire season hinges on squeezing 1,000 ounces a week out of stubborn ground, consistently poor is the kind of phrase that keeps you up at night. Parker had set an ambitious benchmark of 10,000 ounces by the season's end. But as one setback rolled into another, the number started to feel more like a fantasy than a goal. He readjusted to 8,000, still daunting but maybe doable. Maybe those A60s have been just lifesavers. They're packing around almost double what some of the other trucks are packing. I've talked to my dad a lot about, loading trucks. Do you get greedy and overload them a lot, or do you go with what they're rated for? Of course, that kind of turnaround doesn't happen by waiting around. Parker went big. Enter the A60s, 2 behemoth rock trucks, each capable of moving 600 yards of pay dirt every hour. These weren't your run-of-the-mill mining vehicles. These were the kind of machines that turn heads, break records, and if pushed too hard, break themselves. He wasn't just adding horsepower to the operation, he was raising the stakes. The A60s were meant to close the gap between his current pace and his dream goal, but with no spare trucks and no backup plan if one failed, he was betting it all on horsepower and hope. Some advice is hard to follow, especially when it comes from your father. Parker's dad warned him, "Don't overload the trucks, stick to what the machines are built for." That's the safe bet, the smart move, so naturally Parker did the opposite. Efficiency over caution, speed over security. Load them past capacity. Push until something gives. Because if they were going to claw their way to 1,000 ounces a week, they needed every edge they could get, even if that edge walked dangerously close to a cliff. Dominion Creek, it was vast, rugged, and cloaked in potential. On the map it looked like the future. On the ground it was a riddle, one that never revealed its answers easily. This was where Parker had decided to place his biggest bet. With the Sulphur Creek wash plant shut down, its dirt piles depleted, and the crew too thin to restock, it wasn't just a strategic choice. It was the only option left. Right now we are pulling the PR from the downstream end of the long cut, and we got a lot of material that's got to make it up to rock sand to keep it running. All eyes turned to Dominion, specifically to the downstream end of the long cut. A jagged trench of pay dirt that snaked its way through the earth like a scar. It held the promise of ounces if you could move it, and moving it was no small feat. The terrain was brutal, the whole distance punishing. Everything about it was a test of machines, of men, and of endurance, and they had to do it around the clock. With no margin for error and no time to regroup, Dominion had become more than a mining site. It was a crucible where grit met gravity, and every choice echoed through the operation. That's where James came in. Just 22 years old, a rookie with a head full of adrenaline and a heart full of ambition. He'd barely broken in his boots, and here he was climbing into the cockpit of a $500,000 rock truck, responsible for hauling 60 tons of earth through terrain that chewed up veterans and spit them out. At first he kept pace, confidence building, dirt moving, progress made, but then the truck blinked. What started as a flicker on the dash quickly turned into a blizzard of error codes. Lights flashed, alarms shrieked. The cab was suddenly filled with the urgent hum of something very, very wrong. James froze. This wasn't a training drill. There was no call your supervisor checklist. This was raw panic. A mechanical giant crumbling beneath him. The truck jerked, sputtered, and then died. No forward motion, no reverse. Just 60 tons of pay dirt perched on a hillside inside an industrial monster that had lost its will to live. Hey Mitch, you got a copy? We've got a problem. I'm pretty sure this truck just went down. Oh man, that's not what we need right now. Okay, dude. I'll park that thing. The A60 Parker's now a lifeless shell. There was critical damage to brake lines. Hydraulic failure, it wasn't just one problem, it was a cascade. Each brake triggering another, the kind of failure mechanics talk about in hushed tones. And the worst part is it had happened with a full load. James radioed it in, voice shaking. Mitch, who'd been balancing production demands like a juggler with one too many chainsaws, responded with a heavy dose of frustration. Not because James had done something wrong, he hadn't, but because everyone knew what this meant. There were no spare trucks, no backups, and no time. The A60 wasn't just a truck, it was the artery feeding the entire operation. With it blocked, the blood stopped flowing. Production stalled. The wash plant began to run dry. Parker's refusal to reassign trucks from other sites had always been about strategy. Don't rob Peter to pay Paul. But now Peter was starving and Dominion, once seen as a gamble worth taking, was threatening to become a very expensive lesson. The crew gathered around the wounded machine, staring down at the twisted metal-leaking fluid and earth-caked wheels that had stopped turning. The clock kept ticking louder with each lost minute. They weren't just racing against time now, they were racing against collapse. Because in a mind this complex, one breakdown doesn't stay isolated. It ripples outward, fast and unforgiving, and this was just the beginning. Mitch, already stretched thin, snapped. The pressure had been mounting, and now it boiled over. The crew scrambled. The radio buzzed nonstop, and tempers flared. At one point, a mechanic barked back at Mitch. If you want this truck fixed faster, grab a wrench. The breakdown wasn't just mechanical, it was emotional. Everyone was running on fumes. Taylor, the lead mechanic, stepped up. He had one goal: unload the 60 tons of dirt safely, then revive the crippled monster. That's enough dirt to kill someone, and we don't want that. It's going to fall out at some point. We want it to fall right now. There it comes. But that was easier said than done. One misstep could collapse the entire load, potentially crushing anyone nearby. Caution became the new currency. Every bolt tightened, every hose checked, every second calculated. Precision wasn't optional, it was survival. Parker had spent years building his mining empire around one guiding principle. Keep the dirt moving, because if the dirt doesn't move, neither does the gold. And now one of his most powerful trucks sat dead on the trail. 60 tons of pay dirt locked inside it like a coffin. He had a decision to make fast, and it wasn't a good one. There were no reinforcements, no miracle truck appearing over the ridge. Parker had to face the cold math. One truck couldn't keep up with demand, which meant one wash plant had to go offline temporarily. But in this business, temporary feels like a lifetime. That plant capable of processing 300 tons per hour was shut down. The silence that followed was deafening. Machines that had been roaring minutes ago now sat idle. Workers stared at belts that no longer moved, and the worst part was the gold was still buried in the ground, untouched and unreachable. Time was slipping, and Dominion Creek wasn't limping anymore. It was locked in place like a stalled train on a one-way track. Inside the mechanic's tent, pressure had turned to panic. Taylor's team knew the stakes. Every part, brake lines, electricals, and hydraulic hoses, had to be rebuilt with the precision of a surgeon operating in the dark. There could be no do-overs, no second chances. Every bolt mattered. Every alignment had consequences. Outside, the rest of the crew waited, watching the sun crawl across the sky, wondering if they just lost the season. And then a rumble. The sound started low, barely more than a growl, but it grew louder, deeper, and angrier. The A60 came back to life like a monster awakened from a long sleep 6 hours. That's how long it took to rescue the season from the edge. But was it too late? When the truck rolled back into rotation, there was no cheering, no high fives, just a collective breath. Tired, cautious, and quietly hopeful, the wash plant flickered back on. Conveyor belts began their slow, rhythmic spin. Dirt flowed again. The heartbeat of the mine returned, but everyone knew better than to celebrate because in mining, effort doesn't always equal reward.
Everything.
Sometimes time, money, and sweat, and still walk away empty-handed. I'm glad I could start trucking again, moving more pay for the boys. We're back to hauling as fast as we can. Taylor is a wizard at what he does, so he got it back up in only a couple. The weigh-in came days later. Everyone gathered, eyes fixed on the scale, hoping, begging just for something good. Triple digits, a rebound, anything. But the numbers didn't lie. The gold count is lower than last week again. After all that chaos, the repair, the shutdown, the scramble, it hadn't moved the needle. Not enough. They were officially at the halfway mark, 4,175. That was the total so far. The cold, unimpressive truth. Just barely over half of Parker's revised 8,000-ounce goal, and not even close to the original dream of 10,000. Reality was setting in. They were severely behind and falling further with each passing week. The numbers had always driven Parker, but now they haunted him. Because the math wasn't emotional, it was merciless, and it was pointing to a painful conclusion. Unless something changed dramatically, this wouldn't be a legendary comeback season. It would be his most costly failure. And worst of all, the ground still held gold. They just couldn't reach it fast enough. In the gold fields, pressure doesn't just build. It crushes slowly, quietly, until one day it all comes down. For Parker Schnabel, the weight was no longer measured in ounces. It was measured in hours lost. Trucks broken, wash plants stalled, and goals that now felt like they belonged to someone else 2 weeks. That's all it had taken for the season's momentum to vanish. Gold yields were spiraling. A truck had snapped under the strain. A wash plant had gone dark, and no cavalry was coming. There were no extra machines, no reserve crews, no lucky breaks, just the same exhausted faces staring into the dirt, trying to will fortune out of the ground. This wasn't a mining season anymore. It was a countdown. Every decision Parker made now teetered on the edge of disaster. Overload the A60s and risk snapping another drive line, or ease up and watch production plummet. Both paths pointed toward a cliff. He just had to guess which one had the softer landing. And that's the thing about pressure. It doesn't just squeeze the man at the top. It trickles down. It settles into the backs and bones of every single person working the site. I really want to thank you all, and I mean it from the bottom of my heart, and I hope that every one of you guys wants to come back, because every one of you guys has a spot here next year. The crew could feel it in the silence during breaks, in the clipped radio chatter, in the way no one asked about next week, because next week wasn't promised. Parker's machines were marvels. Powerful, relentless, capable of devouring mountains. But machines are only as strong as the limits they're built to handle, and Parker, he didn't believe in limits. The A60s were being loaded beyond spec after day, because if they could move more dirt, maybe, just maybe, they could pull this season back from the brink. But every shortcut came at a cost. Engines burned hotter. Brake lines wore down faster. Fuel vanished quicker than it arrived. Maintenance windows became luxuries they couldn't afford. And the crew weren't machines. They couldn't be rewired or replaced with the turn of a wrench. Morale was eroding not in explosions but in silence. In long shifts with no gold to show, in quiet meals where no one spoke about the weigh-ins, and in the looks passed between operators who knew they were pushing iron to its breaking point, and themselves along with it, Parker was learning a hard truth. Speed is a double-edged blade. It cuts through time, but it can also cut you down. He had always believed that with enough horsepower, hustle, and risk, you could outrun failure. But out here in the raw-boned wilderness of the Yukon, even the biggest machines can break. And when they do, they don't just stop working, they start unraveling everything. So what now? Will Parker double down on the aggressive tactics that got him here? Keep pushing machines and people beyond their limits? Hope for a miracle, or will he change course? There's no clear answer, but one thing's certain: time is running out. The crew knows it, the equipment knows it, and somewhere deep in his gut, Parker knows it too. He bags the week's gold, far lighter than he'd hoped, and glances toward the horizon. Dominion still holds secrets beneath its stubborn layers, but secrets don't make you rich. Only gold does. And unless something changes fast, this could be the season that breaks